Hello, I'm going to talk today about the concept of the social construction of gender. This might be something that you're familiar with, but I wanted to do a quick overview to accompany this week's materials. So, this is a graphic that is used a lot of times in trainings and stuff called the gender unicorn that explains the different elements of how we think about gender. And these are some of the things that um, Sam Kellerman gets into in his video that you also will have looked at for this week. So, what's important here is the relationships between these different components. So, you have gender identity, which is basically the gender that an individual identifies themselves as. So, whether that is masculine, feminine, or any combination of those things along a continuum of masculinity, femininity, um, man, woman. Then the other component that's relevant is I'm going to go to this third one, the sex that you're assigned at birth. So this is usually referred to as your biological sex. And so this has to do with your physicality, your genitals, your hormones, your chromosomes, etc. And those physical attributes that are associated with being male or female. Now, what's important to remember here is just because somebody may have the physical attributes that we associate with being female, it doesn't necessarily follow that their gender identity is going to be man or woman, right? So, somebody might be female biologically and they might view themselves in terms of their gender as masculine. Or again, I'm talking in these binaries, masculine, feminine, but there's a continuum between those two polarities. The other element is gender expression. So you might identify yourself as being a woman, but your gender expression might be more along the lines of ways of being, ways of dressing, ways of using your body language that are more traditionally or culturally associated with being masculine. And again, there's a continuum there. Um, the other thing that's important, especially in relation to what Kellerman said, and will become more relevant as we read more into Michael Arsenault's story, is the relationship between sexuality and gender. So there's not necessarily a relationship between your who you're physically attracted to and how you might express your gender. There's a stereotype, I think, that perhaps is being deconstructed a little bit more recently, but definitely has been ingrained in our culture that if somebody who identifies as gay, that their gender expression must therefore automatically be more feminine. Of course, we know that that's not the case. Someone's gender expression is not necessarily related or is not related at all to their sexuality. And then the other component here is this idea of emotional attraction. So somebody might be emotionally attracted to any sex or gender, but doesn't necessarily mean that they're sexually attracted to that person. So what's important to remember are these terms. So biological sex, the sex you're assigned at birth, male, female, your gender identity, how you identify in relation to man or woman, which might not necessarily align with your biological sex, how you express your gender along a continuum of femininity and masculinity and everything in between, and then your sexuality that's separate from those other components. So it's important to keep these things straight in our mind as we go forward. I don't know why this is a unicorn, but that's the graphic. Okay, so there are other elements when we think about how gender is socially constructed. So it's important to remember that gender is not something that you are born with, it's something that you learn. So, um, because it's a learned thing, it's also something that is complex and it's also something that is changeable over time. So it's a fluid thing. So I wanted to focus on, again, three components here of how we think about social construction. So, how gender is socially constructed has a lot to do with individual identity. So you might be influenced by, or you might learn from any outside influence what it means to be a boy or a girl, or what masculinity and femininity means, and that becomes incorporated into how you construe your identity, how you identify yourself. Or it might be the case that you learn those lessons through life about what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to be a boy or a girl, what it means to be masculine, feminine, and your own sense of gender identity doesn't necessarily fit with those lessons that you learn. It's important to remember that those lessons are so prevalent in our society. They surround us in so many different kinds of ways that we don't always even notice them. So we think about the social construction of gender on an individual basis in relation to identity, and that has a lot to do with how we express our gender as well. It's important to think about the social construction of gender as a social process. So it's something that we learn as a result of interactions that we have with other individuals, family members, friends, people we know, people we don't know. Um, and all of those interactions and those relationships feed into our sense of how we think about gender and our self identities in relation to gender. So it might be that your gender expression is something that is supported and elevated by the people around you, or your gender identity might be something that is looked down upon, or that you're ostracized for in particular situations. So the social construction of gender has to do with relationships, it has to do with interactions on a social level. It also has to do with the things we do, the behaviors that we express in our lives too. We might act in a way that conforms to socially prescribed ideas about what it means to be feminine. Let's think a little bit about our body language, for example. What is a feminine way of sitting? What is a masculine way of walking? What is a feminine way of speaking? All of these things that seem so natural are actually part of a learned process, a social process of how we think about gender. The third thing that's really key here, and which Sam Kellerman doesn't really get into in the video, is the way in which gender, the social construction of gender, is supported and reinforced by social structures and systems. And by that I mean systems like education, criminal justice, the media, the family, religious institutions, all of those kinds of social institutions that reinforce how we think about gender and how we understand what it is, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. Um, Michael Arsenault talks a little bit about this in relation to how his sexuality is seen by his family members, or how his gender identity and his sexuality is seen by the religious leaders in his church, how it's seen at school, etc. So gender is an identity, but it's also a social system, and that social system is reinforced through social institutions. So think about the ways at school, for example, that little kids are arranged into groups, the areas that there are for them to play with, what activities, what behaviors are reinforced or frowned upon by teachers. So that's really important. The other part that's key in relation to thinking about gender as a social system as well as a process of social construction is that the reinforcement of gender norms establishes a hierarchy, and within that hierarchy, attributes and behaviors that we associate with masculinity generally are assumed to have more power, have a higher status than those things that we associate with femininity, with being a woman. So that's a key part, not just the reinforcement of norms, but the way one set of norms is valued over another. And then, of course, whenever you have a hierarchy, you also have power. So, who holds power, or what institutions hold power, or how is power constructed to support this system that is not necessarily inclusive of everybody? I wanted to suggest that some of these social structures are changing a little bit. This is just an image from a catalog, a toy catalog from a couple years ago. And you might notice that it's sort of notable because gendered norms are being sort of undermined and changed a little bit here. A toy catalog is oftentimes one of the most gender segregated uh, um, elements of the media that we see. We have boy toys, we have girl toys, etc., and we get so used to those norms. When we see them switched around a bit, it really grabs our attention. So we can see here there's a baby doll, but it's a little boy that's playing with the baby doll. There's a, I don't know, some sort of Nerf gun, or maybe it's a water shooting gun thing that a girl is using. And so here, when we see what we assume as being natural and normal ideas about gender being switched up a little bit, it grabs our attention. And that's good because we see change in action, but it also draws attention to the fact that these norms have been so ingrained in our society and in our consciousness and in our bodies, in the way we think about ourselves, how we see others, etc. Those norms are so ingrained that when we see something different, it really grabs our attention.